Welcome to this introduction to VBA recording macros. By the end of this module, you'll be able to explain the benefits of using VBA in financial models. You'll appreciate the importance of good VBA planning and documentation. You'll be able to navigate around the Visual Basic Editor window and record macros using absolute and relative referencing. Finally, you'll be able to highlight the limitations of the macro recorder. Before we begin, in order to work with VBA, we need to ensure that your version of Excel will allow you to create and run VBA code. In Excel 2003 and earlier versions, you need to go to Tools, Macro, Security, and set Security to Low. Alternatively, in Excel 2003, you can go to Tools, Options, Security, and then click on Macro Security. In Excel 2007 and later versions, you need to have access to the Developer tab. On the Developer tab, select Code, Macro Security, and select Enable All Macros. If there is no Developer tab, in Excel 2007, go to the Office button and select Excel Options. On the Popular tab, select this and click Show Developer tab. In Excel 2010 and later versions, go to the File tab and select Options, and then Customize Ribbon. You should also be aware that in Excel 2007 and later versions, in order to save your VBA code, you will need to save your work as a macro-enabled workbook, .xlsm. Before we examine VBA building blocks, why use VBA in Excel? There are several reasons. First, Excel formulas can become very long and difficult to understand and/or audit. In VBA, formulas can be broken down into shorter formulas with easy-to-audit descriptive names. Secondly, VBA makes it much easier to quickly update formulas and ensure cells aren't inadvertently damaged in the updating process. Thirdly, VBA models require less documentation in order to understand the flow of the model. Finally, VBA offers many built-in financial functions. All this being said, although VBA has many benefits, do not forget the keep it simple principle. If there is an easier way of creating an Excel solution without VBA, don't overcomplicate your models with complex VBA code. A subroutine procedure is a chunk of code which performs a task or action in Excel. Recording macros is the easiest, most common way to create subroutine procedures. A macro recording is one way to capture a user-defined process within Excel to make it repeatable. Macros work by recording the keystrokes of a user in a VBA-based macro module. This module can then be run again or modified by stepping into the VBA code. Now, let's look at the steps involved in recording a macro. First, before recording the macro, always try and plan your macros before recording them. Secondly, make sure the VBA toolbar is accessible for those with Excel 2003, or that you have access to the Developer tab for those with Excel 2007 and later versions. Next, press Record and give the macro a name and description. As we will see a bit later, you can select absolute or relative referencing. Next, press Stop. and then view and ideally clean up the code using the Visual Basic Editor. Let's also have a quick look at the Visual Basic Editor window before recording our first macro. Abbreviated as VBE, the Visual Basic Editor is the tool used to create, modify, and maintain Visual Basic for Applications, VBA, procedures and modules in Microsoft Office applications. The Visual Basic Editor is included with most Office programs. In Excel 2007 and later versions, the Visual Basic Editor can be found by going to the Developer tab, Code, and then finding the icon Visual Basic. In Excel 2003 and prior versions, the Visual Basic Editor can be found by going to Tools, Macro, and then Visual Basic Editor. The shortcut to access the Visual Basic Editor in versions of Excel for the PC is Alt plus F11. The Project Explorer displays a list of projects and project items in Excel documents. The toolbars you are likely to use are the Standard and Edit toolbars. These can be displayed by going to the View drop-down menu and selecting Toolbars. You can quickly access the drop-down menus without your mouse by using the Alt key and selecting the appropriate underlined letter. The Properties window displays a list of properties for the selected item. If we want to change the name of the module, we do it here. Finally, the Code window is where you can write, display, or edit code. The recorder automatically writes the code in this window. Now let's get to recording a macro. In Excel 2007 and later versions, the macro recorder can be found by going to the Developer tab, Code, Record Macro. In Excel 2003 and prior versions, the macro recorder can be found by going to Tools, Macro, Record New Macro. The first thing you will see is the Record Macro window. All of the items on the screen are optional other than the macro name. It is extremely helpful for other users to describe the macro using the Description window. Whatever is written in the description window will appear in the VBE code window as a comment, highlighted in green, at the start of the VBA code. This is the only comment that will appear in the code. Once you have recorded your macro, you should consider adding additional comments to the code using the Visual Basic Editor window. Okay, now it's your turn. Open a new workbook and start recording a macro. Give your macro the name Absolute Referencing Example. Note that your macro name cannot have spaces. In order to aid readability, we capitalize the first letter of each word. Also type a description in the description window. You may want to type, "This is an example of an absolute referencing recorded macro." Now, enter the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in cells A2 to A4 and then sum them in A5. Stop recording and then open the Visual Basic Editor window to view the code. In Excel 2007 and later versions, the Stop Recording button replaces the Record Macro button after the macro has started to be recorded. In Excel 2003 and prior versions, the Stop Recording toolbar should automatically appear when you hit record. If it doesn't, you will need to have this toolbar visible by going to the View menu and selecting Toolbars, Customize. If you are having trouble creating the macro, move to the next slide where we have provided a screen capture that walks through each of these steps. Okay, let's see recording a macro in Excel firsthand. For this demonstration and throughout this course, we use Excel 2007. In Excel 2007 and later versions, we go to the Developer tab to find Record Macro. Remember that in Excel 2003, Record New Macro is found on the Tools menu under the heading Macro. The first thing to do is to select Record Macro. In the Macro Name window, we will type Absolute Referencing Example. And in the Description window, we will type, "This is an example of an absolute referencing recorded macro." We then hit OK. Next, we select cell A2, and we type 1. In A3, we type 2. In A4, we type 3, and then we sum the cells in A5. Now we hit Stop Recording, and let's view the code in the Visual Basic Editor. You will see that the macro recorder has created a subroutine procedure. A subroutine starts with the word sub and ends with two words, end sub. The macro recorder puts the name and our description in the code as comments. Comments start with an apostrophe and are in green font. You will also notice that the cell references are specific, A2, A3, and so on. This is the default setting in Excel and is referred to as absolute referencing. Here is a screenshot of the VBA code for your reference. Please note that the macro name and description are recorded as comments using an apostrophe. If you want to add more comments, we simply need to type a new line starting with an apostrophe. Also note that the cell references are specific. If we need to change the cell references, there is no need to re-record the macro. We can simply type over the cell references. Now it's your turn. Click on the attachment link entitled Yoo-Hoo Phones Part 1 Exercise with Instructions. And once you've had a go, check your attempt with the attached Yoo-Hoo Phones Part 1 solution. Good luck! Now that we've covered absolute referencing, let's consider how and when to use relative referencing. Relative referencing means that all movements are relative to an active cell. Instead of recording specific cell references, for example A1 or A2, the macro recorder uses the offset function to tell Excel where it should move relative to the active cell. Relative referencing needs to be switched on as the default setting is absolute referencing. In Excel 2007 and later versions, the Relative Reference button is right below the Record Macro button. In Excel 2003 and prior versions, the Relative Reference button is found on the Stop Recording toolbar. This can be accessed by going to the View menu and selecting Toolbars, Customize, and then selecting Stop Recording. Okay, now it's your turn. Open a new workbook and start recording a macro. Give your macro the name Relative Referencing Example. Remember that your macro name cannot have spaces. In order to aid readability, we capitalize the first letter of each word. Also, type a description in the description window. You may want to type, "This is an example of a relative referencing recorded macro." Now, enter the numbers 6, 7, and 8 in cells B2 to B4, and then sum them in B5. Stop recording and then open the Visual Basic Editor to view the code. If you are having trouble creating the macro, move to the next slide where we have provided a screen capture that walks through each of these steps. Okay, let's see recording a relative reference macro in Excel firsthand. In Excel 2007 and later versions, we go to the Developer tab to find Record Macro. The first thing to do is select Record Macro. In the macro name window, we will type Relative Referencing Example. And in the description window, we will type, this is an example of a relative referencing recorded macro. We then hit OK. Before continuing, we will then select the Relative Reference button, which is right below the Record and Stop button. We then select cell B2 and type 6. In B3, we type 7, and in B4, we type 8. We then sum the three cells in B5. Now, let's hit Stop Recording, and let's view the code in the Visual Basic Editor. You will see again that the macro recorded has created a subroutine procedure, starting with sub and end sub. Again, the macro recorder put the name and our description in the code as comments. Comments, recall, start with an apostrophe and are in green font. You will also notice that the cell references are relative to an active cell. The offset function is used to tell Excel how far to move from the active cell. Active cell offset 1, 0 tells Excel to go down 1 row and 0 columns from the active cell. Here is a screenshot of the VBA code for your reference. Please note that the macro name and description are recorded as comments using an apostrophe. Also note that the cell references are relative. If we need to change the cell references, there is no need to re-record the macro. We can simply type over the cell references. For example, we can change the offset function from 1 row, 0 columns to 2 rows, 0 columns, and so on. Now you have a go. Click on the attachment link entitled Yoo-Hoo Phone's Part 2 exercise with instructions. And once you've had a go, check your attempt with the attached Yoo-Hoo Phone's Part 2 solution. Have fun. Let's move to a slightly more challenging task that involves a recorded macro. You'll need the data.txt file that can be found in Attachments. Save it on your desktop for easy access. Now create a new workbook entitled My Macros and record an absolute reference macro. Call the macro Import Text. Next, click the Open File button in Excel, select the data text file, and delete the top 4 rows. Next, right-click on the Data Worksheet tab and move the Data Worksheet to the My Macros workbook, and make sure to move it to the end of all the worksheets. Stop recording and test the macro to make sure it works. Okay, let's see how we can use a recorded macro to automate the importing of raw data. First, we're going to create a new workbook entitled My Macros. We need to make sure it is saved as a macro-enabled workbook. In Excel 2007 and later versions, we then go to the Developer tab and select Record Macro. In the macro name window, we will type import text, and in the description window, we will type this macro imports raw data. We then hit OK. Make sure relative referencing is also turned off. We then open the data file, which on this computer is on the desktop. If you can't see it on your desktop, make sure that you select all files. The text import wizard will then appear. Now, the text file is already formatted so that we can select Finish without going through any additional steps. Now we need to delete the first 4 rows. Next, we right-click on the Data tab and select Move or Copy, and we'll move this to our My Macros workbook at the end. We now hit Stop Recording. Now let's run the import text macro to make sure it's working. We can either select macros or use the shortcut Alt F8. When we hit Run, another sheet with this data should appear. So far, so good. However, on the next slide, we will purposely create a situation where the macro doesn't work. Now that we have created an import text macro, let's create a situation in which the macro will not be able to run and we will get an error message. Delete all the worksheets in the My Macros workbook except for Sheet 1. Now run the import text macro. You should get a Subscript out of range error message. On the next screen, we will discuss how we can debug this macro. Click Debug, and VBA will take you to the line of code where the error exists. It also highlights the line in yellow. Our macro is referring to a variable, Sheets 3, that no longer exists. We can quickly fix this by changing Sheets 3 to Sheets 1. However, even with this quick fix, this code will not work in all circumstances due to the static nature of the code. Instead of hard-coding the worksheet number, we could write code that automatically counts the number of sheets and then moves the data sheet after the last sheet. We will explore writing code in more detail in the other VBA modules. If you are having trouble creating or correcting the error, move to the next slide where we have provided a screen capture that walks through each of these steps. Okay, let's see how we can create and then correct a VBA recording error. The first thing we need to do is delete all the sheets in the My Macros workbook except for Sheet 1. I've already done this. Now we run the import text macro and we should get an error, a Subscript out of range error. So I go to the Macros button, I select Import Text, and here is the error I just mentioned. We then hit Debug, and we are immediately taken to the Visual Basic Editor window and the line of code that contains the error. To correct for this error, we simply change Sheets 3 to Sheets 1. Now, close the Visual Basic Editor window. You will likely get a message that asks if you're okay that this command will stop the debugger. If so, simply click OK. The data text file will also be open because this is where the code stopped and gave us the original error message. We will close this file before running our code again. Now let's run the code again using the View Macros button or Alt F8, and it should now work. And yes, it does. Let's conclude by talking about the benefits and limitations of the macro recorder. The macro recorder is best suited for simple, straightforward macros. You can also use the macro recorder to learn code. All you need to do is record the keystrokes you are interested in and then view the code. The macro recorder can only be used for sub-procedures. It cannot create function procedures, nor can it generate code that can handle repetitive looping or conditional actions. Now you try. Click on the attachment link entitled Yoo-Hoo Phones Part 3 exercise with instructions, and once you've had a go, check your attempt with the attached Yoo-Hoo Phones Part 3 solution. Enjoy! That concludes this introduction to VBA recording macros. The key messages from this session are: VBA makes it easier to update and audit Excel-based financial models and requires less documentation. The macro recorder can be used to automate the code writing process for simple, straightforward tasks. The macro recorder can be set to record using both absolute and relative referencing. Recorded macros can then be edited, updated, and corrected using the Visual Basic Editor. We look forward to seeing you again in the next VBA module. Bye for now.